Everyone, and welcome to Learn to Lead, UNSW's free online course for alumni. I'm going to be talking about responsible technology, and my name is Lyria Bennett Moses. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Law and Justice here at UNSW, as well as director of the UNSW Alumni Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation. Basically, my research is at the interface of law and new technology, and looking in particular around how law should manage some of the new legal issues that arise as technology changes, as well as how we create positive outcomes that we might want in a whole range of dimensions through law and through regulation in evolving technological contexts. So the focus here, leading responsible technology. And I'm going to start with one challenge, which is the fact that there's a whole variety of words and terms that get used in this context. So compliance, ethics, trust, trustworthiness, responsible innovation. How do we know what these concepts mean? What do they point to? And how do we use them all appropriately? So I'm going to start with compliance. This is a bit of a baseline concept. These are the things that law says you have to do, right? So things like not committing crimes, right? Don't do illegal things. Don't hack into somebody else's computer system contrary to the computer crime laws, right? So they're very basic but essential things that are really important, sort of red lines, if you like. But beyond that, there's a whole variety of other legal obligations and legal requirements that are not necessarily in the criminal law. Some of them might have criminal consequences in certain circumstances. Others might only have consequences in terms of fines or opening yourself up to litigation. But in any event, ensuring that you understand what those requirements are and know how you're going to comply with them is really important. So these are things like directors' duties, the obligations that directors owe to act in the best interests of a company. These are things like privacy laws, right? Different at the federal level as compared to state laws, and which one you need to comply with and whether you need to comply with any of them is going to depend on what organisation we're talking about. So some organisations are large enough to have to comply with Australian privacy law, the Commonwealth law. Government organisations and organisations that are sort of government agencies, like even universities, actually comply with state or territory law. In addition to that, you've obviously got some organisations who process data, for example, of Europeans, might have to comply with Europe's GDPR or General Data Protection Regulation. So which laws you have to comply with, knowing that and understanding that, and then knowing how the systems, and that's computer and human systems in your organisations, are going to collectively ensure that you do comply with those requirements about the collection and handling of data is really important. And we can go beyond that, right? If you're a company and you're selling stuff to consumers, then you have to look at consumer protection law. If you're handling regulated materials or you're in a regulated industry, follow those rules. If you're in a sector that's regulated by the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, you have to follow all of those requirements, including, but not only, in relation to cybersecurity. And there's many more. I could not possibly in one slide write a list of all the legal requirements that could affect you or your organisation. But the main point here is know the rules that apply and know in particular which ones you are ultimately responsible for. And if you're a director, you're on the board of directors, it's really all of them. For the ones you're responsible for, know how you're complying. What is done in your organisation that ensures that you comply with those specific legal requirements. And where possible, have deep defence. So don't just rely on one person or one system to ensure compliance, but have measures in place that where that person makes a mistake or where a system fails, something else will catch it. So that compliance is something you can kind of assure through sort of deep defence, that the combination of humans and computers will effectively back each other up to ensure that compliance is built in. Now, compliance is super important, but it's not the end of the game. So knowing that what we did was legal might keep you out of jail, might avoid fines, but it isn't enough if what you're looking to do is to lead in responsible technology. So then we turn to another concept that often gets mentioned here, which is the idea of ethics. Now, the Commonwealth Government has a ethical framework for artificial intelligence. And I put it through a word cloud generator, and this is what you get, right? Lots of really important concepts. So it's all about AI and AI systems, so they're the big words. It's limited to that scope. It doesn't cover other activities that aren't about AI systems, so that's why they're very big. But if you go to all the different words used, there's the importance of data security, the importance of being responsible, of acting fairly, of valuing individual rights, of taking a human-centered approach, of ensuring that decisions are contestable, that ensuring decisions are appropriate, that the systems are reliable, that they're accountable, that you take into account the needs of the community. I mean, all of these things are built into this list of ethical requirements. So it's big, it's a lot, right? But does it work? Does it help to look at all of this in, decision making in a particular organisation? And to help answer that question, I'm zooming in on one of the different ethical principles that you'll find in the Commonwealth Government's framework. And I've put it on the screen. This is throughout their life cycle, AI systems should benefit individuals, society, and the environment. This sounds good, right? Who doesn't want to benefit those things? But if you look a little bit deeper, you'll see why the Australia's AI ethics framework has had so little impact on organisations that are actually making decisions about AI systems. So the first problem is that it puts the ethical obligation in terms of an outcome that machines are meant to generate, right? AI systems should have the effect of having these various benefits. And great, it'd be wonderful if we get to that end state. But what the framework doesn't do or doesn't clearly allocate is the responsibility for the decisions that are going to get us there, right? Who is this? Who is going to make sure that systems are doing this? And you might say, the people responsible for the systems. But that's not just one person, right? You've got the data custodians. So if we're talking about a machine learning system, the organisations and individuals that collect data that's used to train those systems are making decisions all the time. What data to collect, what kinds of cleaning processes to use, what kinds of accuracy checks to perform, right? And depending on their decisions in how they collect and manage that data set, the ultimate system that's trained on that data will have very different features. Then you've got people who might be choosing the machine learning model. And different machine learning models have different benefits, right? So some machine learning models are more opaque than others. So if we're talking about transparency or explainability as an objective, then the choice of machine learning model really matters, right? So that person or organisation is also going to be important. Okay, then it's the people putting it all together, the people actually selling it in the market and what they say about the systems. Are they clear about when it is appropriate to use a particular system and what its limitations might be? Or is it just a sales pitch? Right? And then the users of those systems, if they are aware that the system should only be used in particular contexts, do they deploy it outside of that context? So all the way along the chain, humans, whether individually or within organisations, are making decisions. And it's not clear how all of those decisions, or whose decisions, who is held responsible for this particular wonderful sounding outcome. Because if you don't call it, everyone's going to point to somebody else, right? The next thing to point out about this particular ethics framework is there's a lot of hypocrisy here. So AI systems should benefit individuals, society, and the environment. But more globally, was government making decisions that would benefit the environment at the time? Very contested. Second of all, if it develops systems that don't have the technological sophistication of artificial intelligence, do they still have to benefit individuals, society and the environment? Said no. It was operating what came to be called the robo-debt system, sending debt letters to people who were very vulnerable, like vulnerable Australians relying on welfare, telling them they owed the government money, using a faulty method to calculate debts that it turns out, if they were calculated correctly, were not necessarily owed, and sending debt letters that drove many Australians to suicide. Right? Now, it wasn't an AI system. It was fairly basic technically, but the government took the view that it didn't have to comply with its own framework because of the lack of technological sophistication. So there's an element of hypocrisy there, right? If it matters that we should be benefiting individual society and the environment, it shouldn't only be AI systems that have to do that. It should actually be something that is important for all decision making, right? For government generally to be trying to do those things. The next problem with it is this statement is a little bit of a truism. It's a little bit like when Google used to say, don't be evil. Sounds great. Who wants to be evil? But does it actually affect decisions that organisation makes, right? So, these are hard decisions. When you're in an organisation, there's decisions being made all the time. Do we spend more money on security? Do we do this? Do we do that? Do we take into account the needs of shareholders, customers, employees, local communities, the country, the world? And where they conflict, whose benefit? Which benefit matters more in the context of particular decisions, right? These are hard choices. And making a statement like this, everyone can agree with it, but it doesn't actually help organisations make really difficult decisions. Now, I'm not saying ethics is bad. You can, and I would argue you should, choose to be ethical, right? You can draw on philosophy to answer ethical dilemmas that you encounter in your career and personal life, and that's a wonderful thing to do. You can also think specifically about your role in a technology ecosystem and ask how you can help build a world that we want to live in rather than a dystopia. But we cannot, as a society, simply point to so-called ethical statements like this and say, well, we're done now. We're going to have ethical AI because we've told people that AI systems have to achieve these objectives. It's not going to get us there. What we need to do is find the people who are making the decisions that matter, right? And ensure that they understand and are made responsible for decisions that might hurt individuals, society, and the environment. Okay. So ethics, important, certainly as a personal guiding star, right? We want ethical decision makers and ethical leaders, but as a society, and when we're looking at systems, we need different concepts to help us ensure that we get the systems we want. So another one that's come really popular recently is the idea of trust, right? Maybe what we want is more trust. Okay, so let's start with the concept of trust. Does the world really need more of it? Not really, right? You can talk about people trusting a political leader. Might be good, might be bad. If we're talking about someone like Vladimir Putin, maybe we don't want more Russians trusting him. A lot of people who received debt letters under the robo-debt scheme I talked about trusted those letters. They trusted the government to calculate their debts correctly. And in many cases, people paid debts they didn't owe, or worse, actually committed suicide because of the financial consequences to them of those debts, right? And the despair that led to. So we don't necessarily want more trust. We don't want people trusting every email they receive, right? We want people challenging things and questioning. So more trust isn't a good idea. So maybe we switch to trustworthiness, right? Maybe we say, okay, we don't want more trust, but people and organizations should be acting in a way that is worthy of trust. That means other people are right to trust them. And that's definitely a better move. I'd much rather we say we want more trustworthiness in the world than that we want more trust in the world, but it still has limits. So if I asked everybody in this audience, right, do you trust, Albanese or Dutton more? People would answer probably depending on their own personal politics, right? And if I ask Labor and Liberal voters what the criteria are for trustworthiness in a political leader, they'd probably have quite different lists. So even though we switch to a different word, right, we don't necessarily give ourselves a clear, objective, everyone agrees list of what you need to do to be trustworthy, right? It's often quite subjective. When we're talking about computer systems rather than individuals, rather than humans, we might be able to use better words, right? We might be able to use words like reliability. So we say we want a computer system to be reliable to always do what it's meant to do, right? Rather than the slightly more amorphous concept of trustworthiness. And it's clearer what we mean, right? So in some contexts, trustworthiness isn't the right word. But if we are going to use that word, right, how are we going to know what the list is? Well, again, as I said, there's no one list, but we can look to others and other experts who've built lists, right? So one example is the International Standards Organization, IEC, Joint Technical Committee for Artificial Intelligence Standards. This is a group of experts internationally that has looked at the concept of trustworthiness and talked about what the ingredients might be to get there, and then started to build standards around how to get to each of those particular elements. So this is their list, right? They say that for for trustworthiness in the context of artificial intelligence systems, these are the kinds of things you need to look at, right? Is it controllable? Is it resilient? Is it explainable? Is it unpredictable? Is it safe? All of these words is what they've put together as the dimensions or elements of trustworthiness in that particular context. And one can look elsewhere for similar lists in other contexts and say, okay, here's a good starting point, right? Let's see if we can build these characteristics into the systems to ensure that those systems are trustworthy. Okay, so trustworthiness is a potentially useful concept, but it doesn't give you the list just by using the word, and you can create lists, but there might be some contest in some circumstances around what should be on that list, right? Okay, so I want to move to another concept now, and that's going to be the focus of the rest of these talks. So this is the concept of responsible innovation and responsible use of technology. So what I'm going to focus on in the remaining talks is taking responsibility. And this is not going to be about outcomes for a system, but about humans around the system, around the technology, making responsible decisions. Now, in many ways, I leave open the question of the normative framework. So I'm not going to tell you, which kinds of ethics, to adopt and so forth. I will point to relevant places to look, ethics, human rights, public benefit analysis, and so forth. But part of taking responsibility is also taking responsibility for the normative choices you make. So more on that and some tools as to how to take responsibility in the next lecture.